Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's lesson on perfecting your dialogue. I want to help you effectively add speech to your narrative. And so the question might be, why do I need to add this dialogue to my story? Well, it does several things for your story. The first of which, it increases the pace at which your story goes. It speeds up the story so it doesn't feel like your reader is just dragging their way through it. It's a good way to show off characters' personalities because we learn a lot about people by the things that they say. And so you can use this technique to help you show your characters and who they are by the things that they say to other people and how they treat other people and what they do in conversations. And it can also be used to create many effects such as humor, tension, compassion, frustration, and other emotions, which can really add to your story. We are very verbal creatures and we talk to each other. Much of society works around conversations. And so that's why it's important to add dialogue to your story, those conversations between two or more people. And so to get right down to it, I need to show you the parts of dialogue that you're going to be adding to your story. Dialogue essentially has two parts, a quotation and a dialogue tag. Here we have an example line of dialogue. Finn asked, "What you doing, Jake?" And so we have the dialogue tag here, and that describes who is speaking and how they are speaking. And so here we have the speaker, Finn, asking. He's asking a question. The quotation is literally what comes out of the speaker's mouth. So what are the words that that person is saying exactly? So those are the two parts of dialogue, the dialogue tag and the quotation. If you use those two parts, it'll really help you write effective dialogue. There will be occasions later on when you'll leave out the dialogue tag, but that's a little bit more of advanced writing, which we'll cover later. Now, these two parts can go in any order. You can put the dialogue tag before the quotation, such as Finn asked, "What you doing, Jake?" Or you can put the dialogue tag after the quotation. "What you doing, Jake?" Finn asked. There's no right or wrong way to do this, and it'll be a decision that you make as a writer as you're writing where you want those dialogue tags to be. Do you think the quotation is more important and it should go first? Or do you think the dialogue tag is more important and it should go first? You'll kind of naturally put these in the order you think they should be in as you're writing your narrative. But I want you to realize that there's no correct order. They can go in either direction. And so there's a couple rules I want you to remember. There's going to be 5 of them. And if you can remember these 5 basic rules, you'll have a good start on writing dialogue. The first rule is to use quotation marks around the quotation. Isn't it funny that quotation marks mark where the quotation begins and ends? It's almost like they were named that way for a reason. And so here you can see in my example, Finn asked, "What you doing, Jake?" There are quotation marks around "what you doing, Jake." And so what these quotation marks are doing is they're showing you exactly what words come out of a character's mouth. And so anything between quotation marks is something that a character is directly saying. And we use these punctuation to show that. Now, just a note when you're typing out your dialogue, don't use 2 apostrophes in the place of a quotation mark. It might look the same in some fonts, but then some fonts it'll look weird. And so it's just better to get in the habit of using the actual shift button to make a quotation mark rather than using 2 apostrophes. You'll thank me later because you can get into trouble if you do it that way. Now, just a note on rule 1, quotation marks. If you're having trouble thinking about where to put the quotation marks, think about them as being the same way as you'd use speech bubbles in comics. And so here's the correct way it might look if it were a comic. "What you doing, Jake?" This is literally what's coming out of Finn's mouth. "Making bacon pancakes" is what's coming out of Jake's mouth. This is the correct way. Here's a mistake I often see students doing. They will write, "Finn asked, 'What you doing, Jake?'" And they'll put this whole thing in the quotation marks, the dialogue tag and the quotation. But that would be like the character is literally saying Finn asked, but Finn isn't saying that. And so you want to make sure that your dialogue tag is not in the quotation marks. Only what's actually coming out of the character's mouth goes into the quotation marks. And so if that helps you remember where to put those, I would recommend using that as a kind of a way to help you. Moving on to rule 2. Capitalize the first letter of the quotation. And so when you use those quotation marks, the first letter that comes after that initial quotation mark should be capitalized. Uh, Once you're inside the quotations, the normal rules of capitalization and punctuation apply, but that first letter, always capitalize it. Now, this is a little bit weird because this sentence actually starts here with the word fin. And so that's the beginning of the sentence, and you have a comma, and this is kind of a special rule of capitalization where you capitalize the first letter of the starting quotation, even though it's not technically the beginning of the sentence. Moving on to rule 3. You should always have some form of punctuation between the dialogue tag and the quotation. And so here's what most of your dialogue is going to look like. You're going to have this dialogue tag first, and then a comma, and then the quotation. It's really easy when the dialogue tag comes first because your punctuation is always going to be the same. It's going to be a comma. Now, your punctuation will change a little bit if the dialogue tag comes second. And I have 3 examples of what this could look like. And so if the quotation comes first and it's a question, you're going to put a question mark and then the dialogue tag. If the quotation comes first and it's neither a question nor an exclamation, you're going to use a comma and then the dialogue tag. And if it's an exclamation, you'll use an exclamation point. There's a few more pieces of advanced punctuation that I'll talk about later, but these 3 are going to be what you use most of the time. In fact, it'll usually either be a question mark or a comma that you're going to put between the dialogue tag and the quotation. So rule 3, always put some form of punctuation between the dialogue tag and the quotation. Moving on to rule 4. At the end of the quotation, the punctuation goes inside the quotation marks. So you'll notice here, I have 2 different sentences, and here are our 2 quotations, quotation 1, quotation 2. And if you look at the end of both of those quotations, you'll see here is the quotation mark, and there's a piece of punctuation inside of it. So the question mark should go inside the quotation marks, not outside of it. Once again, it's the same thing here. Making bacon pancakes, comma goes inside the quotation marks, not outside of it. And so at the end of your quotation, make sure the punctuation you use goes inside the quotation marks. And finally, rule 5. This is one of the most important rules. It's going to help your dialogue become much clearer if you follow this rule. Whenever the speaker changes, start a new paragraph. And so here in the dialogue, we have Finn asking, "What you doing, Jake?" Now, the person who's talking is going to change from Finn to Jake. And so in order to show that, I'm going to hit the enter button on my keyboard, start a new paragraph, indent it, and then put the next character's line. "Making bacon pancakes," replied Jake. This is kind of one of those visual cues to your reader that lets them know that they should expect somebody new talking. Because if you don't start a new paragraph, your reader is going to think that the same person is talking, and they'll be confused when they find out that it's somebody different. And so this is one of those ways that you can format your writing to help your reader understand what you're saying and follow the conversation more easily. Because the goal of our writing and the goal of improving our writing is to make something that is easier to read, so your reader is more likely to follow your writing and be willing to continue reading it. And so you'll notice that this is not just the case in writing. If we were to look at a form of writing that you're very familiar with, text messages, you'll see that something similar happens. On most text message conversations, there's a left and a right-hand side of the conversation. And so you'll see that we move from left to right when the speaker or the writer changes. And so here's a clear example of text message. You can see one speaker is on the right, the person responding is on the left. This is another visual cue that helps separate it. And this is kind of the same logic that we use for starting a new paragraph when writing dialogue. It's a way of making things visually clearer. And you can see if you don't use that left-right formatting here in this middle text message, it becomes even more unclear. "What you doing, Jake?" "Making bacon pancakes." "Where are you?" "Right behind you." You can figure out who is talking and who is writing, but it's much more difficult when it's not separated visually. And you have to do more work to figure out. And we want our readers to do the least amount of work possible because a lot of readers don't want to do a lot of work when they're reading. They just want to have the information come to them. In fact, it can get really confusing if you don't use any visual formatting. And many of your writing is like this, where you don't use any kind of paragraphs or breaks to show the writing. And it gets really confusing because it's all in a jumble, like this text message here, all the way on the right. And so if you want to take a moment to practice what you think dialogue should look like, this would be a good moment to get a kind of piece of paper or a Google Doc out to try and practice writing 10 lines of dialogue based upon what you think the people in this picture would be saying. There's no right or wrong answer. Let's just take a look at these people in the picture. This is a famous picture from Edward Hopper. And so take a few minutes, pause this video, and try writing a 10-line dialogue conversation between these people. This can really help you solidify those 5 rules we just talked about. I'll give you a minute to pause and try this out. If you want further practice, once again, here's another chance to practice your dialogue. You could use this picture. And once again, try to write 10 lines of dialogue based upon what you think the people in this picture might be saying. Feel free to pause the video and practice writing some dialogue right now. Now, there's a few more advanced pieces of punctuation that can become really handy in improving your writing. Dashes and ellipses you can add to the ending of your dialogue, and they mean slightly different things. So dashes show an abrupt end, like somebody's being cut off or they had to immediately stop talking for some reason. So Finn asked, "What you do?" And so either somebody cut them off or something happened to them that made them stop talking right away. It just got cut off. Ellipses means that somebody's kind of trailing off. It's like somebody being like, "Look at that." They lost their train of thought or they got distracted by something. It's kind of that general kind of, "Hey, what do you think?" It kind of shows that something is happening that's making them kind of lose their train of thought, not immediately, but kind of slowly and gradually. And so these types of punctuation can really help your writing if used effectively. Now, it always helps to kind of look at the writing of others. And so here I've included a passage from J.K. Rowling. This is from the first Harry Potter's book. And so I want to point out a few things in this line of dialogue. You can see that most often dialogue and narration get mixed together. And so narration is just the narrator telling the story, and that's written in white here. Dialogue is when characters talk in the story, and I've included the dialogue tags here. And so if you're writing really effectively, your narration and your dialogue are going to be blending together seamlessly. And so here you'll see 36, he said, looking up at his mother and father. That's 2 less than last year. You'll notice that there are 2 lines of dialogue in this paragraph. And that's okay because it's the same speaker. This is Dudley speaking in both of these instances. But you'll notice here when J.K. Rowling gets ready to start another character speaking, she moves down a new line and starts a new paragraph. "Darling, you haven't counted Auntie Marge's present. See, it's here under this big one for Mommy and Daddy." And you can see there's no dialogue tag here. This will happen sometimes when writers are certain that you're going to know who's talking. They don't need to explain who the speaker is, and they'll leave the dialogue tag out. Once again, the speaker changes, so the writer goes to a new paragraph. "All right, 37 then," Dudley said. And so you can see that once again, the narration and the dialogue are mixing together. And here is an interesting transition between these 2 paragraphs. So there's a lot of narration here, and there's narration here, but you'll notice the writer started a new paragraph here. The speaker hasn't quite changed on this paragraph. You'll notice that there is narration here, but the the writer is predicting that there's going to be a new speaker. And so the writer knows that they have to start a new paragraph to accommodate this new speaker. But they know that this piece of narration fits better with this dialogue and this paragraph than it does up here. And so you don't necessarily always want to wait until the dialogue starts to start a new paragraph. You want to start a new paragraph where it makes most sense in the narration. But you'll see you only have to start a new paragraph going back up to the top when it's a new speaker. If it's the same speaker as this line shows up here, feel free to keep it in the same paragraph. You don't have to start a new paragraph, but you can if you'd like. It's going to be a decision you make in your writing. And so once again, looking at the rules that I mentioned before, you'll notice whenever the dialogue starts that it's capitalized. You'll notice there's always some piece of punctuation between the dialogue tag and the dialogue or the quotation. You'll notice that the writer always goes to a new line whenever the speaker changes. There are quotations around what is directly coming out of the character's mouth. And you can see in professional writing that those rules still apply. And so we're going to take this learning and we're going to be completing a dialogue assignment. Now, what I would recommend doing is going to no red ink first. I'd recommend going to no red ink first. Looking at your webpage on No Red Ink, you'll see that a new assignment has appeared. It's titled Working with Dialogue. This assignment will give you the chance to really practice punctuating and capitalizing your dialogue. It works with just making sure you know what kind of quotation marks or what type of punctuation best goes with the quotations, and identifying the difference between a flow quote and a actual piece of dialogue. If you are confused about the punctuation of dialogue, I would really strongly suggest doing this assignment on no red ink. Your final assignment for this dialogue lesson is to create 10 lines of perfect dialogue. And so, since this is usually the most engaging part of your narrative, you really want to make sure that your dialogue is effective and properly punctuated. And I want to make sure that you are capable of writing dialogue in the way that's most effective. So, I want you to create 10 lines of perfectly formatted dialogue. And so, there's three ways you can do this. If you scroll down, you will see that there are three levels. And so this will depend on what level of writing you're at, but I want you to complete 10 lines of dialogue by the rules of level 1, 2, or 3. Level 1 just means write 10 lines of dialogue that are perfectly formatted. So quotation marks should be around the quotation, and dialogue tags should describe who's speaking and how they're speaking. Punctuation, usually a comma, should separate the dialogue from the dialogue tag. Capital letters should be at the beginning of each line of dialogue, and new indented paragraphs each time the speaker changes. These are the 5 rules I talked about. If you feel like you have those rules down, I would recommend moving on to level 2. So in addition to the rules of level 1, I want you to write dialogue that has an ellipses to show a speaker trailing off or hesitated, dashes to show a sudden stop, italics to emphasize a word or illustrate a change in tone, and varied verbs in your dialogue tag. So instead of saying said, said repeatedly, you use other verbs such as he whispered, she suggested, he asked, they shouted, right? And if you think you got that and you really want to test your dialogue skills, I would recommend working on a level 3, which in addition to all the requirements of level 2 and level 1, your 10 lines of dialogue should have narration and more abstract language. And so I don't want you to just write the dialogue. I would like you to write the dialogue and have narration telling what's happening in the story in addition to what's being said. And your language should be a little bit more abstract, where maybe you'll be using dialogue tags that include metaphors such as he droned, she chirped, they trumpeted, and just kind of playing around with the dialogue to make it as effective as possible. So the goal of this assignment is to create, either at level 1, 2, or 3, 10 perfectly formatted lines of dialogue. And so I will be checking this, and if there are errors, I won't be accepting it. But you'll be able to fix what any errors that I note and turn in again later. This assignment will be due next Wednesday before 11:59. Should be turned into Google Docs, or it should be on a Google Doc turned into Google Classroom, and it should follow the MLA formatting guidelines as always. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. And I would also recommend checking out, there are many resources on writing dialogue online. You're more than welcome to explore those. And you can always rewatch this video for more information. Good luck on this assignment, guys, and I look forward to seeing your dialogue. Thank you for watching this today.